Hello everyone and welcome to Unit 1, Introduction to Biology for the Online Biology 1046 course. In today's video we're going to be looking at the following topics: the characteristics of life, homeostasis, the organization of organisms on Earth, and the scientific method. First of all, we're looking at the characteristics of life. Basically, there are 7 characteristics of life, and in order to be considered living, all of these characteristics must be fulfilled. If you're missing a few of these characteristics, then you're probably looking at something that is non-living. So the first one that we looked at is order, and order is all about cell structure. If an organism has cells, or if something has cells, then we know it to be living, and it might only be just a single cell, but that's enough structure to be considered living. From cells can be organized into tissues, and then from tissues into organs such as the heart, the stomach, and then from there we go into organ systems. So this is the structure that they're talking about when they talk about internal structure. Now, non-living things like cars and computers, they all have a pattern to their internal structure as well. They might have an engine or a circuitry system. However, because they don't have cells, they don't have that building block of life, they don't really have an organism's internal order. Regulation is the next characteristics to be looked at, and regulation is all about whether something can maintain homeostasis. And we're going to talk about homeostasis on the next slide. But basically, it's the ability to keep a constant internal environment. Growth and development is talking about whether something can grow up and become an adult, mature, get bigger, larger, stronger, that sort of a thing. Energy processing is about metabolism, the idea of taking in energy and then using it to function, whether that be a chemical energy being used to move or to swim, or the idea of taking sun energy, nuclear energy, and be able to change it into a different, like a food energy as plants do, and then using that food energy to grow and develop. So that's what energy processing means in terms of that characteristic. Response to environment is whether something can respond to a stimulus and then act on it. So it all has to do with stimulus and reaction. Reproduction has to do with the ability to create offspring. And then evolution is whether organisms can adapt and evolve over time. So these are the 7 characteristics of life. All 7 have to be satisfied in order to be considered an organism. Many non-living things may show some of these characteristics, but are missing some and therefore aren't considered to be living. Homeostasis is the idea that organisms must maintain a constant internal environment at an ideal state for optimum function. And when this environment becomes imbalanced, it can lead to improper function and to disease. So in this table over to the right, this is what happens when homeostasis is not maintained and imbalances occur. And you can see that, for instance, in our circulatory system, if we have problems with balance in our heart, it can lead to atherosclerosis, which is or heart disease. If we have problems with our metabolism and not being able to balance the amount of energy we're consuming and the amount of energy we're using, this can lead to obesity and diabetes. Problems with immunity can lead to arthritis. So homeostasis is a really important idea to understand in biology because it can lead to, or is the reason for so many of the diseases that exist. So when we talk about external environment, what are we talking about? What type of variables are we trying to keep constant or balanced? One that comes to mind often is temperature. we want to keep a certain constant temperature in our bodies. And the reason for that is that our bodies are really depend on the proteins within our cells, because the proteins are like keys that unlock certain metabolism chemical reactions. And without them, a lot of our chemical reactions can't occur. And temperature affects protein because if protein under high temperature starts to denature or unravel, and when their shape changes, they're no longer able to carry out their function. So that's why temperature is a really important homeostatic variable that we try and keep constant. Another variable that we try and keep constant inside internally is our fluid balance, how much water we have in our cells, inside our cells, in our blood. Water is an important vector in organisms. It helps to move nutrients along. It also creates, it's also a form of a holder for oxygen, which is also important in our chemical reactions. So fluid balance is definitely an important variable that we try and keep constant in organisms. Nutrient balance is another variable that we look at. For instance, how much salt is in our, we want to make sure that our salt is balanced, our potassium is balanced, those types of things. pH is another variable that we need to keep constant. Pressure. Our blood pressure would be an example of something that you need to keep balanced in order to have optimum organ function. So again, homeostasis is really important in order for organisms to function properly, and it's the idea of keeping that constant internal environment. The next topic that we looked at in the textbook is about how organisms are organized on Earth, and the idea that there are different levels or hierarchies of organization. And in the book, they do it from large to small. First of all, we looked at the biosphere, and basically the biosphere is the overarching organization for all organisms. So the biosphere includes all organisms on Earth. And then from biosphere, we start to focus in on the organisms themselves. So from the biosphere, we go to ecosystems, and ecosystems are generally like ocean ecosystems, land ecosystems. Might be looking at a desert ecosystem, and it's all the organisms that are found in those geographic locations. So ecosystem is a lot about geography. Ecosystems can then be divided into communities of organisms, and these communities of organisms are different organisms that depend on the same sort of food and land structures in order to survive. Again, the species in these communities are all different. And then from communities, we go to population. And now we're looking at the organization of organisms that are of all the same species. So we might be looking at a bird population, a deer population, a fish population. In this, all the species are the same. So it's really important that you understand largest to smallest and what's in each of these organizational groups. Next, they looked at eukaryotic versus prokaryotic cells, and the idea that all cells either go into one of these categories. Prokaryotic cells, you can see here they give an example of a bacterium, and then this larger cell over here is the example of the eukaryotic cell. Eukaryotic cells are what multicellular organisms have for their cells, so mammals, birds, plants, animals, mushrooms, fungus, these all involve eukaryotic cells. So anything that's multicellular is going to be a eukaryotic cell. Prokaryotic cells are all single-cellular. Now, not all single-celled organisms are prokaryotic. We do have examples of eukaryotic cell organisms that have just a single eukaryotic cell. Many plant algae are examples of a single-celled eukaryotic organism. But all prokaryotic organisms do have just a single cell, and examples are bacteria. You can also see that the difference between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells are in their internal structures. Not only are bacterium smaller, but they also don't contain the same amount of organelles as the larger eukaryotic cell. And we'll be talking about cell structure in later units, so we're not going to dive deeply into this as the terminology is a bit advanced. So from looking at this, you can then divide organisms into domains, and we have two domains for prokaryotic organisms and one domain for eukaryotes. So we have the eukarya domain of eukaryotes, and they include plants, fungus, and animals, and protists. These are examples of our single-celled eukaryotes. And then on our prokaryote side, we have the domain of bacteria and the domain of archaea. And archaea are different from bacteria in that their internal functions are very similar to eukaryotes. They have RNA that's very similar to eukaryotic RNA. One of the main differences is that bacteria can be found pretty much just in our everyday lives. They're in the soil, they're on surfaces, they're in our gut, they're in animals, that sort of a thing. Archaea, on the other hand, we call these extremophiles. Let me write that down. And extremophiles are organisms that live in geochemically or physically extreme conditions. So an example of this would be the heat vents at the bottom of the ocean where it's really high temperatures, no light. Very few organisms can even live here except for the organisms that fall under this domain of archaea. So archaea, again, extremophiles, but they function a lot like eukaryotes. The next topic that we looked at in Unit 1 is the process of science and the idea that there are two main scientific approaches in science. The first one being discovery science. And the example that I give here is Jane Goodall and her research in nature of chimpanzees. And a lot of her work involved being out in the environment and looking at family groups and then writing down her observations and making and then analyzing those observations for results. The other type of scientific approach is hypothesis-driven science, and in this type of approach, we're looking at trying to answer a question by carrying out an experiment. So in scientific method, basically you observe a question in nature, you create a question from that, and then you create a hypothesis which predicts the result of what's going to happen through an experiment. So hypothesis is a term that we come across in this unit, and the hypothesis is a prediction or the predicted answer or result. It's not a guess. And the reason why we don't like to say that it's a guess is because scientists, when they're creating experiments, they do a lot of research before they even begin an experiment. And the question that they're testing, the hypothesis, is based on a lot of research. So they're not guessing, they're not pulling an answer just from the air. It's as a result of lots and lots of research. So hypothesis is more of a prediction. It's a predicted answer or a result that they're going to get from an experiment. And here's the scientific method kind of written out in cartoon form. First of all, you're going to define a problem. Then you're going to form a hypothesis to that problem, an answer to the problem. And then you're going to test your answer through experimentation. And that experimentation may be through further observations, or it might be through a structured experiment. Then after the experiment or the observations, you're going to organize and analyze the data that you were given. And from this organization and analysis of a data, you're going to get a certain result. And that result might mean that you have to go back to the drawing board and improve your experiment or do more observations. Or the result might be that you have an actual answer to your question. You draw a conclusion. And then you're going to communicate your results through a lab report, and then let your peers read it and see if you can get published. So usually that involves your peers trying the experiment for themselves, making observations, and seeing if you actually came up with the results you did. So scientific method, in the end, the result usually forms two things. You can either get a law or a theory is created. Usually the most immediate result is a law, and that is basically a fact. It's an answer to an immediate and specific question. A theory, on the other hand, is a lot of facts put together, and it's more of a global explanation to a scientific um, idea. And I'm going to go into the difference between those in a moment. So here examples are of some laws or some facts in biology that came about through experimentation. Law number one is all phenomena of life are consistent with the laws of chemistry. Number two, the cell is a fundamental unit of life. Three, life is continuous across generations. And four, life evolves. So you can see that there's even a little bit of characteristics of life involved in these laws of biology. And this is the overarching principle that laws are facts. These are the answers to many, many experiments. They're very specific, and they answer usually a specific question. Over time, when you're doing a lot of research on a specific area and you get these results and these laws are created, sometimes you can group them together to form a theory. And theories are usually involve many scientists over a long period of time, and it's an evolving look at a certain aspect of science. So for instance, we have cell theory. And cell theory was produced by scientists like Theodore Schwann and Rudolf Virchow, and it's gone on for hundreds of years. And here are some of the proponents of the cell theory: the idea that all organisms are made of one or more cells, that cells are the basic building blocks of life, and that all cells come from pre-existing cells. And theories evolve over time as they usually include the laws that came about through scientific experimentation. And then as new research comes out and better technology, these theories are improved upon and evolve. And lastly, the difference between hypothesis versus theory. The hypothesis is usually narrow in scope. It's a tentative explanation or prediction, and it's very specific, whereas theories are broader explanations, and they're the best explanations to date. We basically take theories and we deem them to be true until they are disproven. So for instance, the cell theory is the idea that all organisms, all living things have cells. We know that to be true. So theories aren't guesses. They're what we know to be true at this moment. So they're the best explanations to date. So I hope this video has helped you with Unit 1, and thank you for watching.